book is I have equated all of these forms of discrimination because they are real until we have walked in other people's shoes and we understand the pain of the exclusion and the injustice that we visit upon them. I do not think we can credibly say that we are the society that we want to be. We have a very long and stubborn history, which has given us a certain racial order. Over the years, it has become politically incorrect to talk about race unless when we're angry. And one of the things we need to do, we need to talk about our history of racism. We need to talk about how it has influenced the shape and structure of our society, how it has influenced how we define what is normal and what is correct to do. And that if we really want to build a new society, we need to make it a habit and make it to have this conversation, because what we are trying to do is to not leave any baggage for future and to truly start afresh. And the symbolism of the Springboks and Bafana Bafana is more about giving meaning to what we already intend to do than what we claim to be, but we really are not. So the past has given us a lot of disintegration. It's given us disintegration of families because of people had to go and work in different places. In Johannesburg, it's given us disintegration of communities as well. And all of these, because of the nature of the history that we've had, have given us certain racial patterns which give us the today that we have. I have thought long and hard about whether what we have done so far, and this is what we've done so far, we have relegated the task of building a new society to government policy. And we have neglected that the history that we had came from a moral deficiency. Racism and apartheid and everything else that came with it was a moral question. And if we are going to reconstruct ourselves, it necessarily needs to have an ethical foundation as well. And if we cannot agree about the meaning of right and wrong in various, and I'll make a few examples without being too long. If we cannot agree on the meaning of right and wrong, and when a white person is involved, sometimes it's not so bad. When a black person is involved, it is horrible, and vice versa. We are then on a hiding to nothing because we contradict ourselves. There are those who propose sometimes that the idea of ethics that is often proposed, so when it comes to corruption, for instance, about why people accept certain gifts that they should not get. And they do things that they should really be doing for everybody else, but they do it for special people. And then we ask a question that says, but white people used to do it as well during apartheid. The question is, so what do we do now? Do we still call it wrong? Or do we still call it wrong? Or do we now say, we will decide who is involved and then we will decide whether it is right or wrong? And we must think very carefully about the lessons that we are then giving to future generations. I think what we are busy doing, we are busy deforming and distorting the kind of future that we leave for future generations. And we cannot have a discussion that merely relegates the responsibility to politicians, because politicians do very, very strange things. In this city, there is a case of people who stole funeral money. Who steals? Forget that it's Nelson Mandela's funeral. It's funeral money. You don't touch funeral money. And yet we have become these people who have become tolerant. So we've constantly created an environment by allowing these kind of things to happen and not being sufficiently outraged to take action, that over time it will be very difficult to say things are wrong because we can always find an excuse, an excuse for it. So an ethical foundation in constructing a new society is important. Now, those who say, for instance, the corrective statements that we say are the same as what, for instance, the opposition will say, or what their perceived enemies are. If the truth is the same as what your real or perceived enemy is saying, then you still need to say it because the reason for which you are saying the truth is different. Someone might tell you the truth because they want you to feel bad, but there are those who tell you the truth out of love because they're trying to build you. What we are doing, we say, don't say the truth because it is the same as what those that don't like me, which cultivates a culture where people can do whatever it is that they want to do and there are no consequences, and that we do not do anything to correct in the long term the wrong that has been done. The second thing that we have done is we've relegated the discussion on what our values to the politicians and to politics. What we have not done is to recognize that in the end, the political choices that we make are moral and ethical choices. Politicians don't bring contracts to us to sign, to say, I undertake to do this. We do it because we believe in what they're saying. We take them at their word. When someone breaks that word, it should necessarily lead to consequences for the relationship of trust that has supposedly been established between ourselves and them. We therefore need to have an environment where the balance of power rests always with the people. The word minister means servant in its original formation, but the manner in which we ourselves choose to defer to politicians suggests that they are bosses. So they come to us and apply for a job, and we give it to them. And then we pay their salaries. And then immediately after they become our bosses. How does that work? It's not supposed to work like that. So as much as we could want to blame politicians, the final responsibility rests with us because none of them put a gun to our heads and say that we need to vote for them. Everything that is wrong in our society that we do not like, that we talk about in our private spaces, that we write about in newspapers, that people phone on radio and talk about, in the end, the final responsibility in any democratic society lies with the people that made the choices. So when we've got these kind of problems, and then we have a deeply divided society, which is racially divided, can we form a united nation when there are ethical differences that we have and there are differences that arise from our history? Is it at all possible? My proposition is that yes, it is, but we cannot do it without the following. The first is honesty to ourselves, always. People get uncomfortable when you say we have a racist society by its nature. It doesn't mean everybody else is racist, but the nature of our society and what it is largely emanated from racism and racist policies. And therefore, when we talk about transformation of society as a whole, fundamentally, this is what we're doing. People are uncomfortable to talk about land restitution. If South Africa's hundreds of years was about land, the restoration of land ownership to Black people becomes a fundamental act of reconciliation. The choices, though, that we have right now is how we go about this discussion and how we go about with the restoration of people's dignity and with the construction of a new society. If we choose to act like these divisions do not exist, this history was not the same as it actually was. We're going to misdiagnose the problem. We're going to come up with dishonest solutions, and we will never, ever solve the problem, and the divisions will continue. And this is what happens when every generation that has got an opportunity to make a change doesn't do it, is that it resolves itself. And the manner in historical conflicts resolve themselves is through violence. And that violence is destructive. It destroys all of society. So it's not just the history, it is the lack of agreement on what right and wrong means in the public space and in how we exercise the power that we have in our different positions. So what we need tonight to sit back and think about is what kind of society are we constructing? I know South Africans love a good story. I love a good story too. There's a lot that has been done, but we cannot run away from the reality that 20 years after democracy, we are not the society. I also do not accept the argument that says we've given up. The future generations will be different to us. So just leave it unresolved. that also does not work. It is a cop-out. And many people in their old age, in our old age, will sit back and we will know deep down that we could have taken different decisions, made different choices, and we didn't, and we abdicated the responsibility to do so. So what we need to do is to have a uniting idea of justice, which is premised on what I believe is an honest interpretation of reconciliation and its purpose. And fundamentally, the country that we should try and build is one where the resources of the state, our individual and collective talents, are always first and foremost directed towards those who do not have the means to participate fully in being citizens of this country, not just in the economy. And speaking of the economy, there is another dishonesty that we visit upon ourselves, and that it is possible to empower Black people while denying good quality education. It does not happen like that in 2014. If we cannot give people the opportunity and the means to participate in a modern economy that is integrated into the global economy and all of its challenges, we are failing at the basic task of empowering Black people to regain their full citizenship and dignity in this country. People don't want to talk about this, but it is so very, very important. We talk about creating 100 Black industrialists. How do you create an industrialist? What do you do tomorrow? It's not something that you create. We're not having the kind of honest conversations that we need to have, because we believe in the magic of making a law and a regulation and things will suddenly happen. It is not going to happen in that way. We also need to make sure that we depoliticize politics. There are all these isms that people talk about, your communism and your socialism and all of these things that we claim and we abdicate our responsibility to. Here's something about capitalism and socialism and all of them. They were all conceived or came to fruition a long time ago, first of all. Secondly, not on the African continent, and not necessarily in response to the specific conditions that we have here. And to sit and propose a communist solution or a socialist commission is to be lazy, irresponsible, and dishonest. Because our primary responsibility is to think, is to understand our environment and come up with solutions that are going to respond specifically to our conditions. It might be the same as what is done in America. If it works, we must do it. It may be the same as what is being done in Cuba. If it works, we must do it. But we cannot be these people who are forever borrowing from other people, because we want not to take the responsibility of thinking ourselves out of trouble. And then we leave that responsibility to politicians, the very same politicians that we've got so many problems with. The last point I'm going to make before I give Nomalanga a chance is that there are many kind of falsehoods that have been peddled, that the business of business is business. It's not. If you're going to ask business to contribute to community, to contribute to development, the business of business can no longer be regarded as just business. You cannot say the role of the church begins and ends on Sunday. It does not. It is a 7-day responsibility. The congregants of the church are affected by the very same problems that affect people every day. Nobody in this country, if we're going to build it, needs to stay in their lane. Because if you stay in a particular lane, who made that lane for you? Who is only a preacher in church but is not a parent? Who is only a preacher in church but is not affected by service delivery or is not affected by crime in their community? Where do we get this falsehood that if you've got a problem, the councillor must resolve it for you? Councillors are there to perform a function, but citizenship is a full-time job for all of us, and so many of us fail at it. And we've created these boundaries, these false boundaries about where people can participate in their own society. And we cannot continue along this road and hope to have the kind of society that we're going to have. What we need to think about tonight is when we look at the country 50 years from now, how will our role be judged? The Judicial Services Commission is busy selecting judges today. It is entirely possible that Mr. Julius Malema could have been one of those selecting judges today. He is also a criminal accused. So let us think about it. This is not a comment only on the person of Julius Malema. What kind of society has criminal accused choosing judges? What are we going to end up with 10 years down the line? If anybody had said 10 years ago, the police would be called to parliament to remove people, all of you would have said that's impossible. It's happened. What's going to happen in 5 years' time? If we had said in Mandela's country, before he died, the police would shoot and kill people for demanding better wages and for demanding service delivery, just about everybody in this room would have said, on 10th May 1994, Nelson Mandela said, never, never, and never again. It has happened. What we need to ask ourselves is, so what have we done? The answer is, we've done nothing. I do not know of a people who do nothing, who get what they want. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zibi. Is the tilting of scales of power creating a paradigm shift that will see the power shifting to the people instead of politicians the way to go? And when we use a system of values based on ethical foundations and recalibrating society, especially the moral fiber of our society, as Mr. Zibi has put to us, the way to go? Dr. Mkhize, come on stage.
Thank you to the Dispatch, Sanbona Nonke. Thank you to the Eastern Cape for adopting me. It is a privilege, Songezo, to engage you on this book. You know I'm not going to give you an easy pass, because precisely your book says, let's not give each other an easy pass. So let me take up the challenge here. I would like to start by provoking you and saying that the time for this book hasn't come. It hasn't come precisely because of the things that you write about in this book. This is a book whose time has not come. So in a way, I'm calling it prophetic. Because the society you describe in this book is a reactionary society, is a thin-skinned, hypocritical, fearful, unwilling to face the truth kind of society. This isn't a book that can be likened to the kind of stuff that some of us are prone to writing in the media to try and get a reaction, because this is a book which will ask the reader to think, and to think about themselves, and to reflect, and to ask yourself, really, in 2030, what will we look like? So when I say this is a book whose time has not come, I'm really just saying the people who have to engage with this book may not yet be ready. So somehow the challenge is not the book, but the society. In your book, you're calling us to be nuanced, to tackle difficult questions. And I think you do this in very simple, deceptively simple ways. Let me give one example. I know I'm not supposed to give away the whole book because people have to buy it and things, so I won't do that. In this book, you ask us, Khatebe, to get into really Simple things, but complicated things. An example, you say, the issue of the slaughter of animals. Now that one really pricked me because I'm rural like yourself. So I wouldn't want anyone to enter that domain easily, especially not a white person. Okay, Songezo, you've thrown up the challenge. In the book, he argues, when Black people move into the suburbs and they want to slaughter, there might be an outcry from the neighbors of a paler skin who say, but animal cruelty in the backyard, this is unacceptable. Then Songezo does this thing in a gentlemanly way, say, but you should have reflected on what you think is the norm or the value that you ascribe to that practice before you cry about it, and consider the history of segregation that has not exposed you to that practice. Just when I think as a Black person I'm off the hook, then you come in and then he says, but hang on, Black people, how much of our culture did we lose in transplanting ourselves to the suburbs? They make animal cruelty because you've forgotten how to slaughter. And in that very deceptively simple example, we are asked to start reflecting and engaging with nuance. 6 decades of African liberation. To whom can we ascribe our problems? Who will devise the future for Africa? Recently, I read an article in which we are told that the reason that the Ebola outbreak got out of hand at the time that it did last year was primarily because the World Health Organization offices in those West African countries, those people who were staffing those organizations were political deployees, not health officials. Now we're facing a global pandemic. There is a question about the generations. Who will pass on the baton to the coming generation, or the generation that has already forcefully seized its place in parliament, as you see in the Red Berets? They have had to forcefully seize their place. And in that same breath, I can argue that the ANC Youth League is almost dead without Julius Malema. Having been suppressed by the adults in the ANC, one of whom is my father, you can see he doesn't suppress me much. But having been suppressed by a generation who received a baton from one of the most stellar generations of leadership. When my father came into public service, he was 37. He was Songezo's age, thereabouts. He was one of the youngest people in public service and served for 10 years as the MEC for Health for KwaZulu-Natal. And in doing so, in his youth, or his relative youth, he probably made some of the most fundamental transformations to health services in KwaZulu-Natal. I don't know that he can do it at this age, because youth has to its side an energy and a kind of a boldness. But that youth was not without a covering of eldership. Can we argue that we have that right now? Songezo has a chapter on leadership where he asks, what is leadership? There is a generational question. Songezo, I want to pose maybe a few questions, and perhaps it will come out too in the discussion. You ask us to talk about unity, to think about unity. 100 years after the infamous 1913 Land Act, we as Black people still feel like aliens in our own country, even as middle-class people when we find ourselves unable to buy a house in the suburbs. But generally, the feeling that this land of your forebears, all of our forebears, the Khoi, the Sana, Makunkwebe, and so on, we feel that we have not yet been given the dignity of reclaiming this land. How are you going to tell us about ethics in that context? It's not 2 days ago that a young man wrote on News 24 that we should take up an armed struggle. That is a born free. So Songezo, I have a question for you. On whose terms are we going to derive this ethical consensus? Who is going to guide this conversation, how would this thing happen? Whose values must be considered? Whose values must be made more prominent? Surely it cannot be Johann Rupert, Prince of Afrikaner Folks Capital, who owns more than 100,000 hectares of Graaff-Reinet. It can't be him. Because in my Africanist self, I'm like, but that land, surely it can't belong to one man. Who's going to guide this? I'm happy that in your book you touch on culture, but we also need to talk about power. Is it going to be our Honorable Patekile Holomisa, who would much rather see me in a kitchen? Thank God my father, as rural as he is, sees women differently. So we have a chicken kind of egg scenario. How are we going to work this ethics in this unequal society of ours? I'm going to ask you another question, about 2 minutes from the end. You tell us that policy and governance are part of the picture, but not the whole picture. And that we have to have this ethical infusion, which I think we can all feel somehow we have been, it has been eroded in the South African soul. But can I ask this question? BEE, could we have had it as is, as long as Cyril was more ethical? Your book is a call for agency. It is a call for citizens to take responsibility. It is a call for leaders to be responsible. Perhaps I could find it on page 144, because I think this sums up quite nicely what you say about leadership. And I think this is possibly why this is a difficult book. It is the responsibility of politicians to inform citizens candidly that there is no magic solution to their problems, whether or not they are creations of colonialism. Okay. So there's a need for leaders to face hard questions, for citizens to not expect magic solutions. I think the book is asking us truly to just sit down and ask ourselves who we are as a nation, whether indeed we can be a nation. I like what you say about ideology, because I think that is the beginning to start an intellectual conversation around these ideas that have shaped our thinking, those that are explicit, such as Marxist theory, and those that are implicit, like our cultures. Yeah, I think let me leave it there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mkhize. Let's welcome back on stage, Mr. Zibi. We can clap, it's all right.
Thank you, Nomalanga. There are so many questions and very, very difficult as well. Let me start with the question of who will devise the future for Africa. And I need to say this as carefully as I can. The first is that we cannot construct a future without the benefit of the experience that those who are older than us offer to us. Because there are two ways in which we can learn. Either somebody can teach you, or somebody can teach you, or you can learn from your own mistakes. Sometimes we never get to learn from our mistakes because they destroy us. So for that reason, that guidance is important. But we also need to think about whether we want to completely give up the responsibility of constructing a future to people who will not be around to see it. I say this because a lot of the discussion and what informs us in South Africa today has got a lot to do with our past, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the question we've never successfully dealt with is how to construct a future that does not regurgitate and repeat our past. and we call that a future? How do we break the cycle of bitterness and go on from, it's a complicated issue and I will deal with it, and go on from there? The reason I propose an ethical foundation is because some very, very hard decisions and admissions are necessary from all of us. So, when somebody says to white colleagues and friends and our compatriots that I'm not saying you didn't work hard for where you are, but it is harder for me as a black person because I have to overcome so many different obstacles in order to get to where you are. So let me make a very simple example. Again, whenever you see people walking next to the road going to work and not in any form of transportation, they're likely to be black people because they don't have cars forward, the public transportation that takes them to work. This is the reality of our society. The ethical foundation I'm talking about is where all of us, black or white, male or female, that is not something we become comfortable with because it represents our past. The present we have is in the form of our past, and we want to get to a situation where it is possible for people to get to work with dignity. It means that we have to accept that the resources of the state and the nature of the opportunities that become available, like I said before, are given incrementally to those who do not have. In any room, where you look at income patterns, where you look at availability of opportunity, you will find out of 10 people in the room, 8 of those will be black. We don't want to talk about race because it is uncomfortable, it takes us back, but we have to talk about it because when it eventually catches up with us, it will be ugly, and we all have a responsibility to make sure it doesn't get there. So let me also, along the same vein, deal, for instance, with the matter of land. And in my unscientific assessment, there are 2 types of people who complain about land. There are those who see who have a genuine need for land, and there's lots of those people. There's the tiny few who hate the fact that white people have got so much of it. But if you gave them a piece of land tomorrow, they wouldn't know what to do with it. Seriously, right? Does the existence of the latter mean that we do not have a land problem? The answer is no. So there are 2 ways. I believe fundamentally that policy and the law must be an expression of the consensus in society. And consensus is not allowing yourself to be held to ransom by the few who do not want to work towards a project of reconstruction. But the best way we're going to get the best outcomes out of the law is when the majority of us voluntarily subscribe to what the law is attempting to do. Otherwise, we'll need to police everything. So Nomalanga mentions Johan Rupert. It needs to become uncomfortable. We need to make it uncomfortable for the Johan Ruperts and whoever else to have so much when the people around them have nothing. It needs to be something that we talk about openly, because what we are trying to do, we're trying to formulate a new idea of justice where I accept that I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper, and not in the sense of family, but in the sense of the nation that we're trying to build, that I cannot sleep well at night when I have so much and I have the means to give away so much of what I have and still be left with a lot, and it is not available. So the biggest fear that human beings have is being ostracized by their own community. And we do not use ostracism enough. So we use the law. And then I talk to a retail company chief executive who says, they must come and try that BEE with me. People walk through the door and buy. What are they gonna do? Stop them, right? So what do you do? What do you do then? Right? You tell the guy to shut his shop. You don't, but what also never happens is that we do not then exercise the choice of not buying there, which is where the responsibilities of citizenship are. So we do not apply our own agency in cases where we need to be. The big hurdle in all of this is when you have a political governing class that is untrustworthy. So the problem with somebody who lies all the time, when they tell you the truth, you don't trust them. You do not trust their intentions. Even if they're good, you're always thinking, what are they really trying to do? What are they trying to get at here? Right? I have huge problems with BEE in its current formulation. I really do, because what we've done is we've said we will select a few of us to eat and become rich and fat on our behalf while we go hungry. This is what we've done. It's not jealousy against black people. Because that is the other falsehood that we have. Is it wrong to question whether we must have the kind of empowerment where only a tiny fraction of people have the benefits of the new South Africa and the majority do not have that benefit? So the absurdity is that, and I used to work in mining, and you'd have a BE partner who is composed of 4 people. And this is approved by the Department of Mineral Resources. You are now empowered and transformed. The community in the Northwest from which the minerals are dug has got 0 share in that community. And we sit here and we are happy. And when you question that, you are jealous against black people's wealth. It should not work like that. It should not be a heresy to question BEE as we have it now. The question of ethics, when we've got so many inequalities, I'll answer it in 2 ways. The first is, so what happens when we do not make it a question of ethics? So it is about what we choose to make an ethical problem. The inequality is an ethical problem that we should not be able to live with, all of us. And it's not enough to point at the government and say, oh, but they're stealing all the money. They stay together, all of it. If not a cent was stolen tomorrow, it would not be enough to save people from poverty the next day. It really wouldn't. This is our reality. But there's many of us who have more than we need, who choose not to invest that in constructing the kind of society that we have. So that is where we need to start. It is the same question with land, as I've said. If for hundreds of years the conflict was about land dispossession, a fundamental act of reconciliation is a restoration of land ownership to black people. Because what will happen if we do not do it that way, out of our own volition, out of consensus with an ethical foundation, the Zimbabwe that we are all scared of is going to come here. So we've got choices to make. And whose values must be made prominent? I believe in what may be a complicated answer, and this is my final answer on this round, and that is, I believe what we need to conceive and come up with, and I do make some suggestions in the book, is that it needs to be premised on our constitution on the one hand. On the other hand, it needs to serve as a foundation for its application. Because this is what happens. We all believe in this great constitution, but if we were to do a survey here and ask people to vote secretly about the return of the death penalty, right? A lot of people would say, of course we want the death penalty back. I've taken away your pen. Now you can't write notes. I wasn't sabotaging you. A lot of us would do that. If somebody asked, this constitution of ours allows for homosexual people to have full rights of married couples to get married. Should we do it? Do you want to take a poll now? A lot of people will say no, it shouldn't happen. So that means what we believe is an idea of justice and the right thing to do, whether we agree with it or not, because it is just and fair. We're not honest to that purpose. It's in the constitution, but we do not believe it. And we need to be people who say, I can live with difference in my society. because not everybody believes in the same thing that I do. And not everybody sees things the same way that I do. But if we are to be a just society, we must fundamentally give everybody an opportunity to be the person they should be. As long as they don't harm society, of course. We can't allow criminals to be criminals. But this is what we need to do. Thank you.
All right, I'll ask just 2-3 questions from our panelists. And after that, we'll then open it up to the floor. If you have questions, prepare those questions. Any comments that you have, prepare them. Mr. Zibi, I'm going to start with you. The revolution in South Africa did not come about because people just woke up one day and they decided we want to have a revolutionary spirit. It was the unwillingness of the government of the day to actually give people what was due to them or what was rightfully theirs. It was greed, dishonesty, self-preservation of minority, where we saw they wanted to advance their ideals in our society. And this continues. The unwillingness of those in the willing buyer, willing seller phenomenon is actually at the center of some of the advancement by some political parties that we must now expropriate without compensation, because feeling adjust. When we're looking at what you have brought forth, there is some sort of a cozy relationship where people, they are all found on the same platform, willing to do things, happy, peaceful, tranquility in our world. But truth of the matter is that people are still greedy, people are still dishonest, and people are on a self-preservation mode. Now, in the light of that, how do you think, or how do you propose that we introduce the society that will be more accepting these values that you are bringing?
Does this work?
Yes, you can use that one.
Thank you. One of the falsehoods that we have in our discussion is that we need to change the constitution in order to have expropriation of land. Well, not quite, right? They wanted to build a Gautrain in Johannesburg, and eventually people were asked to move and sell their homes. So you couldn't have one person. The requirement in the constitution is that the reason for which this is to be done must be in the public interest, and it must be done, must not be an arbitrary decision. So that is the first example. The second example, I worked in mining. So the way the mineral rights system works is that if they discover gold under your house, it's not yours, you don't have a claim to it, and they move you. You get moved. Entire communities under this constitution, entire communities get moved to go and live elsewhere, as an example. So the legal instruments are there. There are 2-3 things that have been missing. The first is that the political will and the leadership to advance this conversation and to do things in a way that demonstrates the justice that we want to bring to our country has not happened. So the people that had to sell their houses and had to move from their land to make way for mining companies, which I worked for some years, were then given what was considered adequate compensation. So it can be done. But I also believe that in order for this to happen correctly, we do need the trust in the instruments of state that are doing it and the leaders that are doing it. So one of the problems with the Zimbabwe land reform process, for instance, is that it has also provided an opportunity for another form of creating a new elite, where those who are politically connected to ZANU-PF got the prime land and the opportunities. See, when you do that, you denigrate the very purpose for which you are trying to do things, and it becomes a problem. So that is the first thing. So the Constitution allows us to do this. So it's only There's discussion about a land valuer general and the valuation of land and so on. And I ask myself, so if this can be done under this constitution, why wasn't it done 10 years before? Same thing that happened in Zimbabwe, by the way. There is an externalization of the problem, but ZANU-PF for many, many years did not feel the pressure to deal with this problem, did nothing about it until they were facing a political credibility problem, and they picked it up as a political red flag, and it worked, right? So the opportunities are there. The second thing is that we must not fool ourselves, like I said earlier, that everyone is going to agree with the instruments. But what we lack in our politics is what I call, for lack of a better word, I call teaching. There isn't a constant conversation. Our politicians address us, they don't talk to us. They come and they give a speech and they move on. There is no conversation. America has got its problems, but there's something that I like, and it's called a town hall meeting when there's a presidential campaign. And whoever is running for president or for the Senate goes there and they sit there and people take questions and they ask very, very difficult questions. Part of what we've done here, we've got this annoying concept of collective leadership, which means when I sit here, the failures and other vices which are dangerous for society that we question. So I sit here, I do not have credibility. I'm trying to convince society to take a very difficult decision. It is not going to happen. Fundamentally, I am not trusted. But I think the land problem, to answer this question, is not easily resolvable. But the instruments are there. We've just elected not to use them for this purpose. But when we need to move people to make a mine, we move them. When we need to build a highway train or a road, we move them. But when we need to talk about the land reform program, we don't want to do it.
But what do you say then on the issue of the willing buyer, willing seller, where the seller pushes the price?
The same instrument that was used to move people for the highway train should apply, isn't it? The law needs to be consistent.
You reckon?
Unless I'm misunderstanding the legal principle. But what happens, what you potentially would have had people selling 2-bedroom houses for 10 million.
So you're suggesting that there is political unwillingness?
There's political unwillingness. There's been political unwillingness. And part of it has come from what we believed was the delicacy of the situation post 1994. And that our primary objective is to keep the rest of us comfortable. Unfortunately, what that has done is that state of transition has become permanent. And it is the permanency of that state of transition which is leading to so much discomfort and conflict and the use of what I believe is violent language, because naturally you reach a breaking point.
Dr. Mkhize, let me bring you in. Would you agree?
Would I agree? I think I can agree that there's a political unwillingness to tackle the land question. And I think it was most evident in the recent case of the Mala case, game reserve deal, where the state paid, in the media, they said 1 billion for a game farm. The government paid 1 billion for a game farm out of the land reform budget of 9 billion. Then this is one restitution case in which they spent that much. That's what they told us in the press, but from what I hear in the back room, it was double that amount. Now, they could have taken the case to the Constitutional Court to force the owners and to force the system to effectively say 1 billion is too much and restitution is a political question. But the Minister Ungwinti, he opted out of the Constitutional Court battle. Having said that, though, the judge before the Constitutional Court said that the market price that the owners had used was viable. So there is a sense in which perhaps, I think I like what you say about a permanent state of transition. We are constantly talking the language of as if we are still just out of Codesa. So we are very reluctant to have a confrontational or combative view of the land issue. So perhaps that is one of the issues. But I think if I take your thesis around ethical issues, who benefited from 1 billion rands worth of transaction? 1 billion rand tax-free went to the owners. Chances are people were brokering that deal and there are BE partners involved. So that leads to the mistrust.
All right. Then your question, you refer to the book as rather a prophetic book. We are at a time where we are talking about the disintegration of families, destruction of social fabric. We're talking about lack of access to amenities and infrastructure being some of the problems that we are faced with. Now, can we continue to reflect to books such as these as prophetic when we know that we have really problems, child-headed homes that are found within our society?
I suppose that's really a question for the writer. I think, though, what is important at this point in South Africa is not to abdicate intellectual and, what's the right word? Not just intellectual, but abdicate your responsibility to be part of a process of thinking. And what has happened, I think, on the African continent is that we have shut down difficult conversation using our inherited political language of struggle. The working class will smash the white monopoly capital, or whatever language we've come with. So perhaps the challenge, I'm guessing that, Songezo, you are asking us to really take this discussion further. I accept the challenge, but the question really for you is, how does one really create a deeper sense of reviving that conversation? Because I think it is a difficult conversation.
All right, just before you move, I would like to know from you, don't you believe that some of the anomalies that we find within our society, government, from the local sphere right up to national, that some of the problems which include corruption, nepotism, and all of these things are fundamentally value-based?
How is it that 25 years ago, people fought against one of the most evil systems on the planet and did so successfully based on a moral principle, and then 25 years down the line are undermining that very principle? That is a question we must answer. Let me not answer the question you're asking me. Let me pose a question. In fact, Salim Padat poses that question. And he will be very rough, Salim, as a struggle person. How did Meg Maharaj, how did that shift happen? And that, for me, is a question. So if we say corruption, etc., these are ethical questions. The question is, how does one being in their consciousness move from having been willing to die to being a problem?
Well, we would have to move even further by suggesting that standing on that moral ground, they all were morally upright.
I'm going to need you to repeat that.
We would have to move that fighting for that moral high from that moral standpoint, the individuals themselves were morally upright. This is why we're assuming that they have shifted right now.
Yeah.
But chances are they were not.
No, but being morally upright is always relative to your situation. And in fact, Songezo, see, prophetic, you see, you talk about some of this in the book, right? Because you talk about now, do we accept a polygamous president in America? This would be a problem. So that problem of relative ethics or relative morality, rather, is something you try grapple with in the book. Because this is why I say this book is forcing you to think. Because it's saying, now take the instance where we say it's okay for Mr. Zuma to have 5 to have 5 wives. And then you mentioned the French, who I think as well take a kind of a blasé attitude to that. And then in America, it can derail your entire campaign. So you see, there's questions that you can't just answer them. You got to think, okay, in this context. And what I learned was a beautiful phrase. I don't know who gave it to me. And that phrase was contextual intelligence. And this is what this book, I think, you're trying to get us to have.
All right, Mr. Zibi, just before I open it up to the floor.
On this question of being morally upstanding and being in the struggle, there is something we need to recognize, and that is, it is easy to stand for the right thing when you're feeling the pain directly. When someone else is deeply affected by something and it doesn't affect you, we are not so quick to move to protect them or to assist them. The struggle was the same. We must not fool ourselves to say everybody who gave up their lives and was prepared to give up their lives took the decision in an abstract, and that they had a choice whether to have a comfortable life and not be in the struggle, or to struggle and survive all the dangers that came with it. A lot of the decision had to do with the unbearable nature of the conditions they experienced at the time. So it always has to do with a material problem. The reason we are now the people that we are, it's easy to do the wrong thing. And it makes perfect sense that the same people would twist the same principle, like innocent until proven guilty, for instance, in order to do exactly the wrong thing. And we fail ourselves and we fail them because you said, you know, I'm in the investment business, and give me, say, 5,000 Rand, and I'll invest it for you. And then the next day you hear that the same guy is actually has a case here in East London for fraud. How many of you would say the guy is innocent until proven guilty? So because it affects you directly, materially, now suddenly you're more stringent in the application of the ethical principle. And we must not be surprised, because different environments influence us to behave differently. So when we've got the trappings of power, you know, people say, you know, Steve Biko or Chris and wouldn't have done this. The reality is we don't know. They never had patronage and power to dispense. Honestly, let's be honest here. We don't know. Some of the same people that are a problem today were the Steve Bikos of the past. And one of the biggest failures we have is in living in this fantasy world of what would so-and-so say. The question is, why aren't you saying it?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our guests. We're now preparing to take questions. You'll see that there will be ladies in white shirts with microphones. You just lift up your hand, and we'll take the first round of questions. Come back down here, or up here rather. Which one is up? Then we'll take the next round of questions after that. Do we have anybody somewhere? Oh yes, we do have one. Do we have somebody else? We have another hand up. And yes, we have a third one down here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Or you call, or is it program director? Okay. Mr. Program Director, I'm welcoming the two guests from the Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, as this lady was saying. Welcome to East London. Unfortunately, this hall is not that full. In some other dialogues, you'll find that it's packed until police come to drive them away. Okay, let me go to, I want to say, Mr. Zibi, what you are saying, I'm about to come nearer to Dr. Mkhize's view that this book is not yet relevant at this particular time. You can finish off what she had said. Why I'm saying so is because to me, it does not really give me the sense that I had before coming here. I think the title is Raising the Bar. And I was interested in the following things like politics, leadership, and what. So to me, it has not really raised the bar. It has not reached the bar.
Okay.
Why I'm saying so is because I thought that perhaps you would dwell into things, particularly the one that affects us most. Why the country is like this, it's because of the leadership, the political leadership. So I would be happy if you, in your next edition or another book, you can reach out to those things. Try to give us food for thought. Because for now, what you have said to me does not really excite me. Why I'm saying so, again, it's because I have here in East London, fortunately you've mentioned East London, that there are people who are stealing funeral money. It doesn't end there. You'll find that even the premier-elect was in a way involved in this thing, in this province. So you will need to also write about our province. The Eastern Cape province is a province really that was destroyed by the present government. I don't care whether you can say there were directors from SEBEC, government administrations, but they were doing good work.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Here now, we don't get those people. All those people are gone.
Okay.
We get the comrades with their political.
Thank you very much. We have to give others an opportunity. Thank you very much. We may take you for the second round of questions, but thank you very much. All right, Mhlekazi.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Evening.
Mine is not a question, it's just comments. Mr. Zibi, thank you. I think the book is quite intriguing. I've got 3 comments. You touched on the nerve of a few things that I would say that are very emulated to me personally, because, you know, 93 was the worst year in my political life. As a young boy, when we were brought together, Dr. Mkhize, amongst others, your father, you know, encouraging us to come as young boys at that time, representing the youth in the pre-talks and then the talks. You know, I remember that I was one of those who were kicked out at the Captain Park because we did not agree with what Mr. Zibi is raising in the book, which was the notion of allowing people who might not be there to decide for us. And unfortunately, that part came to haunt us. You know, we saw that we actually became an irresponsible nation. We gave politicians the full responsibility to decide for us when the very structure of politics in itself, it's irresponsible. I agree, we have to revisit not only the Constitution, but the whole agreement at CODESA. We keep talking about CODESA and people don't know really the details, the truth about CODESA. People don't know what happened. And Dr. Mkhize, please, with due respect, try to ask your dad to sort of push on that truth to come out, because it's very important for us to understand it as a society. The second point is the issue of correcting the educational system. You know, I'm an illiterate, Dr. Mkhize. That's what education says. If you're not educated, you're an illiterate. It is said that as an illiterate, you end up employing PhD holders, doctors like yourself. And then you sit and you look at you surrounding yourself with a lot of these capable minds and capable heads. And people who went to school come to the situation where they can't find work. And we say we have an educational system. We can't continue like that. I think think it's a very wrong thing. This education needs to not to be overhauled, like we say. We need to implement our own educational system. And the last point is the issue of governance. We don't have government. We took cut and paste. Mr. Zibi again dealt with this issue, and I don't want to repeat on what he said. Again, when we raised this matter in CODESA as the youth at the time, we were not listened to, unfortunately. We were told that we don't know what we're talking about. When we complained that we're trying to turn South Africa into another America, we're trying to turn South Africa into another Europe, and yet we're in South Africa. The dynamics of our country, the challenges that we have. I have a problem that I'm in a hall, in an auditorium in East London, and somebody sitting in Cape Town through technology tells me the temperature here. It's different, when it comes to humanity.
Okay.
The pain that I'm feeling here is different. So
right.
in closing, in constructively, the first speaker, I think let this not be the first. Can we have a follow-up to this, Mr. Zibi, so that it unpack the issues that maybe you would get from us as well? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We had a hand down here.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a good opportunity actually to see that the dialogues are being rolled out in the Eastern Cape. We really appreciate that. My question is directed to Mr. Zibi. You mentioned in your response regarding the synchrony regarding unity, that we should consider unity. Is it realistic to consider that, considering that also, again, in your response, you've highlighted the impediments with regards to actually accessing opportunities where BEE is concerned, that now has become an impediment. And the second part is, we've allowed differences, people to live to live according to their differences and understand and accept that people are different. We live in a democratic country, but we've seen that has diluted ethics and all that. Is it realistic again to now start thinking, about the synchrony of unity after considering all these things?
Well, thank you very much. That was the first round of questions. We now come to our guests to respond to them. Prepare your next questions. After this response, we'll then come back to you. Mr. Zibi?
Thank you. Let me deal with the first one. The issues that you raise in your questions are in the book. Mine was not to exactly say what exactly is in the book, but to provoke a discussion around some of the topics that we deal with. Politics, government, race, violence, and so on are all in the book, and the meaning of leadership and so on. So I would still encourage you to engage with it, because I think those questions are there. But the specific response I have for you, though, is that I do not accept that we can blame the ethical and other problems we have entirely on so-called leaders. In a democratic society, citizens make conscious choices about who is best among them to take charge of public responsibility and to exercise their judgment and expertise for the advancement of society. When we make poor choices, we cannot say it is their fault. They are a reflection of our choices and who we are. We may not like it, it might not be you individually, but the reality is that the majority of us see no problem with the kind of people that get elected. Let me make an example, a real example. Somebody was arrested for allegedly raping a fellow resident from 2 streets down there where they live. And they ran for the local council a few weeks later in 2011, and they won. Whose fault is it? with that action, people actively chose to side with the alleged perpetrator of rape and sent a message to the victim that your pain does not matter to us. This is who we are. It's not comfortable to think about, but this is who we are. So everything that we have, unfortunately, is a reflection of what we are prepared to accept and what we're not prepared to accept. So that is my response to that. And therefore, the agency to change this. I have never heard of a hyena agreeing that, well, I'm actually not going to kill the sheep anymore. It's not going to happen. So we need to change it. The role of the youth, I'll just talk broadly about CODESA and the arrangements that arose out of CODESA. I have come to believe that with the benefit of hindsight, different decisions can always be taken, better decisions. And I want to defend the ANC here because the pressures that existed at the time on the ANC and its inability to continue with struggle at that time is a reality we must never discount. It was not possible to continue the struggle. The Soviet Union had collapsed. There was no money. People were stuck in the camps in Uganda and eating rats. So when we say that certain things shouldn't have been accepted and so on, we're saying this with the benefit of hindsight as if there were lots of options available. There weren't. It does not mean that the CODESA solution was perfect. The responsibility that we have and the responsibilities of leadership is to make the kind of reformations to whatever solutions have been there in such a way they respond to the material problems of society. That is the failure. So we have to accept, people talk as if MK and Apla and all of these guys were never going to march into Pretoria and take it over. We must accept it. It was not going to happen. So, in fact, we can go back and look it up. I think it was in September 2006, and Thabo Mbeki in his weekly letter wrote about this. And don't want to be too long-winded. And he said, when Neil Barnard approached, sent an intermediary to ask the ANC to negotiate, Oliver Tambo called him and Jacob Zuma and said his biggest fear was twofold. The first was that the ANC was going to get so lost in the armed struggle itself that it would forget its purpose. And the original purpose of the armed struggle was to force the government to negotiate. And therefore, he sent the two of them to go and hear them out. So it's easy to sit here with hindsight and say certain things. I understand you were there. In fact, I was part of those young people. I was 18 in 1993. I was 17. And my friends had just been killed in Umtata by the SANDF, and I was very angry. And I didn't think F.W. de Klerk should have got the Nobel Peace Prize, and so on. So I fully understand the difficulty. But we also, I think, have a responsibility to remember history for the difficulties that were experienced at the time. Where I agree with you, though, is in these interest groups that we have in our politics, like a women's league and a youth league, to make representations to whom? Really? Why are young people who are in the majority in this country a special interest group that must lobby to be listened to? I don't believe that's right. Rather, we need to ask why it is that membership of political parties given a choice on their own. So if the ANC didn't have a policy that says 50% representation, would the rank and file reflect the transformative attitude of the party's policies and voluntarily elect women? And the answer is no. That is a question that we have to deal with. Why is that so? Lastly, I'll deal with the question of unity. And I'll ask a question. What is the alternative? Division. And which divided society has ever prospered? Because our choice is stark. Our choice is this. We can try and destroy whichever sectors of society we do not agree with, so that we can then implement the final solution, in inverted commas, that we believe will take us forward. I am not sure that's going to work. Can we give up on the idea of a united society that is able to handle very difficult conversations about its past and what its future needs to be? I don't think we should ever, ever give up. But what we haven't done is we haven't been honest. Thank you.
Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Mkhize.
Thanks. It feels awkward to be answering questions at your book launch. Okay. I think, let me be clear that my feeling about this book being prophetic has to do with the fact that I think the conversation, if we were somewhere else on the African continent, it would be on time. But because in South Africa, we are always lagging behind the rest of the continent with our political discourse, then this book hasn't yet, it's going to be difficult for it to pinch us. Almost 60 years ago, Africa received its independence. It's now almost 60 years ago. It's unbelievable. It's not 20, it's not 30, it's almost 60 years since this continent finally, began that process of removing the colonial stranglehold. And for most of the continent, the colonizers were there for 40 years, maybe 50 years. Now, I know some of you will tell me about neo-colonialism and so on. We will dispute that later. I can dispute that later in many ways. But in South Africa, we had a situation of what we then called colonialism of a special type, because actually the Eastern Cape and the Cape were the first to be colonized in the entire African continent. 150 years before anyone else felt it, the missionaries were already opening Bibles here and everyone was happy, well, not happy, but already kind of defeated and moving on with the times. So the South African condition leads us to almost forget that we are actually almost mimicking the trajectory of our brothers and sisters on the rest of the continent. And that is why Mahmoud Mamdani said to South Africans, you need to get over your exceptionalism. So yes, we are 20 years only into democracy, and what we see falling apart under our skies is the leadership and so on. But if we were to go to Ghana or Tanzania, in fact, where Tanzania, where their budget, 60% of it is foreign aid. Can you imagine 60% of your state budget is aid? Are we going to get there? I mean, the question for us is this: are we going to try and envisage a future that is of our own making, rather than one in which we progressively stumble towards as citizens? And that's why I think this book for South Africans might be a little bit, tell us about what we see every day. We know we want to do that. We live in that. Whereas in fact, we have a very deep crisis coming, and it's going to start hitting us around 2019 as we go forward. Because by 2019, this generation, your comrade Zweli, will actually be so in retirement, we can't even ask them for their advice. So just to, I think, let me not address some of the questions, because I think, Songezo, it's your book launch. Let me just touch on the question of education, and I will, as best as I can, continue to challenge Comrade Zweli. The only problem is, for the same reason that I cannot convince my father to give me a tender, I cannot convince him of other political ideas either. So I'm probably more EFF in the family than he is. So I don't know if I can convince him, but I will definitely be pushing this issue of the generational question that you raise. What I want to talk about is education, and I want to wholeheartedly agree with you. And perhaps, Songezo, these are the discussions we need to have. And sometimes I like to say, these are conversations we must have as Black people. I'm sorry for being the Africanist at the table. I'm not a non-racialist. I'm an Africanist.
That's fine.
Okay. Okay, I believe that Black people must just take it up and solve the problem on their own, and white people will follow our lead, right? Because this is our political problem, politically, in terms of our political lineage. The problem with our education system is that it's copying something that was invented in Britain 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, and bits of something that's happening in the first world. Nobody has yet to ask, how do you educate a society where 60% of the population at this current point cannot find full-time employment? And if you read anything I write, be it in the Business Day, sometimes in the Dispatch, wherever, what you'll find is I'm very frustrated with the education system. And I will tell you something. I was at a summit where there were a lot of ANC leaders and so on. And for one moment, Songezo Zibi, who was then the MEC for Education of KwaZulu-Natal, stood up and said, let's start dreaming of the ideal school. Hey, the delegates from Nehau to Satu, everyone was excited. We're going to dream of an ideal school. Deputy Minister of University, he says, no, we've got that in our books already, in our documents. Read here, this document, page 32, what we've got the ideal school written down. You went to that page and you discovered it said there's, an ideal school is one where the principal comes on time and the teachers come on time. So I wrote a letter to Deputy Minister being very youthful, and I said, Deputy Minister, why are you shutting down this conversation? But it was gone. So perhaps in the middle of this education crisis, and you will read, if you read in today's Business Day, and I think the Dispatch, I'm talking about the fact that we have an education crisis that is frustrating parents because we can't find schools for our children, good schools. Well, what are we going to do about it? So I feel that there is opportunity for us to really think for ourselves, and in acting outside of the state, sometimes new things will come.
Thank you very much, Doc. Let's take the second round of questions, which will be the last one for tonight. We do have somebody here, we have somebody there, and the last hand there. Yes.
Thank you for that. Mine is somehow to defend the African leaders that we have somewhat. If you give a child who is 5 years old 1,000 rand, they squander that money. If you give someone who is 10 years old 10,000, chances are they will squander that money. The perspective that I'm coming from is nobody in Africa had a background of managing a country. Nobody. We received the country, it's yours. What do you do with it? You have freedom, it's yours. When's that? Right? Step one. So they couldn't look to the fellow Black African leaders that were there because they had squandered their wealth. Right? And they couldn't look to their white counterparts because they were their previous oppressors. So they did the best with what they have. If you look at, you gave the example of the American democracy. That democracy is over hundreds of years old now. So it's not, and the way that it transitioned, it's people that won the independence, they were generals. So they had military expertise. And that democracy has evolved into intellectual leaders, should I say, right? So now what I'm posing to South Africa, or what I'm posing to us is, yes, we have leaders, they were willing to die for us. Unfortunately, from a country management perspective, they were not experts. But they are their leaders that brought us into independence and freedom. And we owe them for that. They have made mistakes as our fathers, but our role as their children is to cover for their mistakes. Wait.
Okay, all right.
You're not listening. Is to cover in the sense that, Dad, you're falling short in this particular area. How do I compensate for your weaknesses? If we are going to go there in a militant stance, they're military leaders. We're not going to win that battle. That's just my comment.
All right, thank you very much. We do have a second hand up there and the third.
Thank you, Program Director. But mine is just two questions. One,
all right,
is directed at songs. The first question that I need to check, it relates to this. You made reference to ethical behavior, ethics, and Dr. Mkhize made reference also to ethics and also made examples about the context in which you look at ethical behavior. My understanding is that part of ethics relates directly to the nation. So that when we're beginning to speak about ethics, we speak about ethics in the national context. Now, in the South African context, given all these other issues that we're talking about and so on, you also go into the Constitution. The Constitution will speak about civil servants that are maintaining highest ethical standards. My question is, given all this context in South Africa, where would you then anchor this ethical behavior? What would be the basis? Because for me, also, ethics relates to nation building. Now, in an ideal situation, I would have said that there's supposed to be national ethical standards. Now, my question also would be whether, yeah, the issue is in our context, given this transition, would we really say you have got a national ethical standards that we could even talk about?
Okay.
That's the first question. And where would you anchor that? The second question relates to what you spoke about. You spoke about active citizenship. And as we're talking about active citizenship, my understanding then, if you're speaking about active citizenship, you're beginning to talk about members of society being active, challenging issues in terms of issues that directly affect them. Now, what then in a society is possible is that it is not as easy as that to simply stand up as an individual and begin to articulate what you would call, but issues are articulated better in an organizational situation. And therefore you would then need to organize, to mobilize people around the issues that directly affect them. Now, given the fact that what I think all of us, we are aware of, the situation that we find ourselves in is a situation that seeks to say, wait and trust. This is what I'm seeing if somebody speaks there and say, okay, listen here, we will build houses for you. Stay in these shacks, wait and trust us. We'll come back. Whether we come back next year or after 10 years, and then our people will be demobilized in that context. And from that point, it begins to say, for me, that the powers that be are beginning to articulate a particular theoretical position in terms of how to deal with this. But then you were also talking about depoliticizing politics. And my understanding is that if and move into active citizenship, you need to organize your own people, mobilize them so that they're able to take issues, because the wait and trust attitude it needs maybe to translate it to, or what do we do in the meantime?
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last hand.
Thank you, Program Director. I've got only one question, but I would like to preface my question by making the following acknowledgement, or shall I call it confession. When I came in here, I came to listen because it is my belief that in engaging in dialogues of this nature, listening is part of conversation. So that's why I'm the last to ask the question. And secondly, what touched me more, which prompted me to come and ask this question, is because Program Director, it's the education part of it. When Dr. Mkhize made mention of the crisis that we have from the education. And the part of the confession is that being a generation of June 16, which unfortunately the writer of the book was not born then, as I have detected from his input. Have you, in your critique, I must also confess, I haven't read the book, I've just bought it now. I just want to understand in your critique of the present public discourse, have you ever looked, I know you have made mention of it, the danger of the citizens being sort of sheepish in looking at the policy makers or politicians, because policies can also lead to people going the other way around if they are not directly involved. But there are those good policies in our country that had all the good intentions. Like I'll make an example with the one that relates to the education. We have got a no-fee school policy, which was meant to obviate the burden of the parents from our townships, villages, from paying for the school fees. But now the unintended consequence of that is, one, now those schools remain poor because they are not allowed to raise funds in the form of school fees. Now you get your Model C schools, which are given the permission by our government to raise fees, and exorbitantly so, to the extent that they even debar some of our parents from the poor communities for enrolling their children in those schools. Now, which takes us back now to reverse kind of apartheid, where those children that come from poor communities cannot be enrolled because of the high fees. But the consequence, the unintended consequence of that no-fee school is that poor as those schools remain, you'll find teachers, everybody is in disarray. Teachers are not paid properly because there's no top-up in terms of the monies that they're supposed to be paid there. Okay. And even the infrastructure of the school is deteriorating and whatever. The money that the government pays in all the schools equal, whether it is a no-fee or a fee school, it is equal to compensate for the salaries of the school teachers. Right. But at no-fee schools, there is no top-up, and then that makes them to be worse. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to answer the first question about, the background about African leaders not having had the experience of managing a country. It's true. In fact, what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in 1961 or 1962, when they gained independence from Belgium, they had 42 university graduates in the entire country, 42. They never stood a chance. They really never stood a chance. I also agree with you that our job is to fix and sacrifice for the mistakes that our forebears did. And one of the things I write about in the book is a need to accept that the fruits of our labors will be enjoyed by future generations and should. And that we are the people who have to accept that because there are no quick fixes, we're laying a fresh foundation for future generations. But let me also say this, because it's something that has damaged the African continent and continues to do so, especially South Africans. And that is the same leaders who led Africa to its independence, various African countries, have proceeded to carry out the same kind of abuses or worse that colonialists were doing. And when one of them eventually gets arrested, a Charles Taylor, eventually, and we watched, and you can go to YouTube, children are eating people's flesh. We then say the ICC is biased, which is an academic discussion for me, because I ask myself, who then will ensure justice for the child who has no arms? So if someone gives the middle finger to the West or to white people, we then defend them. And in doing so, we do nothing about the position of ordinary Africans who are suffering under the yoke of abuse from their own leaders. And this is where I say, this is why it is important that those of us who see a different value set for our future need to make sure that those kind of people are no longer welcome in this continent. The reason they end up at the ICC is because we won't do it ourselves. There is no African Criminal Court. There isn't going to be one. But we make odd choices. We elect 90-year-olds to lead us. To lead us where? Where is a 90-year-old going to lead you? Will they be around in 5 years' time? Seriously. So we allow ourselves to be hijacked. And this continued long tenure. I was writing a different book, which my friend next to me here saw some of. And I did an exercise. That book got stolen, by the way. I lost my laptop. And so I'd done a survey of African presidents, many of them, in power 30 years, 26 years. What new can you come up with after 30 years? So there are these very difficult conversations that it's not a glib and ignorant suggestion to say that generational change is necessary, because it is these people who patronize us and hold us back. And this continent continues to become a dark continent in a way, as it has often been said, through our own choices. The ethics and nationhood, that's a very important question, because we are not a nation. We are a country of different interests, ill at ease with one another. We're not a nation. We fight in an instant. I know other countries do, but part of the problem is that if you were to ask about a typical South African or what the South African value sets should be, and you will not find it. We all look after ourselves, basically. And that is the environment in which we're facing, and we cannot go forward with it. I do make suggestions in the book, so I will not go through them. They're by no means the beginning and end of what I believe should be done, or what any of us may think to be done, but that conversation is necessary because ethics, you are correct, is founded on a common idea of nationhood and what constitutes right and wrong. Once we are a nation, it is only then that we can successfully ostracize the people that do the things we believe are against our interest, and not rely on the criminal courts all the time. Active citizenship. Let me explain what I meant about the depoliticization of politics. Because you see, this is what we do. When people march down Oxford Street here for service delivery, we call it a service delivery protest. We don't call it politics, you see. And when we talk about crime, I listen with interest all the time. Ministers talk about reducing conduct crimes by 8% and reducing this by 7% and this. And I think, what is a conduct crime? Do people understand that? The language we do not use is the one that says we want your daughters to be able to go to the shop after sunset and not be molested on the way there or back. Because it talks to the kind of society that we want to build. We don't paint, that is what I mean by depoliticizing politics. So this notion of policy, and I know lots of people lie. I always have interesting conversations about people who say, I vote because of parties' policies, which is nonsense. So I read most of the major political parties' policy documents, and I talk to their own members who haven't read them, who don't know what is in those policies, which is why I say we make subjective moral choices about who should vote for, and we must not complain when the wrong outcomes, we see them. And the dangers of citizens being sheepish, one of the things that happened was this: the civic organizations, I'm not just talking about SANCO alone, but all those structures that were there to fight for the cause of communities and vulnerable people and the weak, became part of the political elite. So if you go to SANCO today, they're not going to fight for you too much. especially with an election coming up, right? Because the Sanco person is also eyeing a potential councillorship or being an MPL later on, right? It's not going to happen. And there is a need to construct new organizations which perform those functions. So you're correct. The mobilization and organization of people is necessary. But what we have done, and Nomalanga will tell you all about this, that has all been outsourced to NGOs. And they are professional NGOs who don't even go to the communities they fight for, but they are there. And they get lots of donor money to go to court and this kind of thing. You can talk forever about it. So we've abdicated that. There is nothing heretical about a community organizing itself so that its voice is heard by the same government they voted for. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, in the Western Cape, there's an interesting phenomenon. So the DA won, and everyone thought it was a fluke. Then the DA won again, and then it won again. But the DA doesn't have a union, right? So COSATU is still big. So COSATU members in the working class areas vote for the DA. Yes, they do. They do. Otherwise, the ANC would still control the Cape Flats. It doesn't. They do. So we must not patronize. This is what our politics does. It patronizes people to say they cannot manage their different interests as one person. That as a worker, I want to be represented by Sakao or whatever. But for my political interests, the ANC or UDM or whatever the case is, people are able to make these kind of decisions. The falsehood is that you must necessarily do the following. You're being treated like a sheep and you do it. And this is one of the things that need to change if we're going to have a different society. Thank you.
Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Well, we have come to the end of today's program, Dialogue. And I think that after all that is said and done, the questions that we have, or questions I would like to pose to you, is can we raise the bar by discussing values, race, leadership, politics, government, violence, and the position of women within our society? If you think that we can, well, raising the bar contains all of that. Thank you very much to our guests. Till next time, good night.